The next group is the one that again is only mentioned in passing within the Gospels. And this group are called the Zealots. In many ways today, we may call them the rebels, we may call them the revolutionaries. In fact, for some, we may even call them the terrorists, because that's really how they operated. We need to constantly remind ourselves that Israel, or Judea at this point, was under occupation. It was under Roman domination during the time of Jesus. And the Jews didn't want to be dominated by anybody. If we look through the history of the Jews from the previous 2,000 years, we can see that they also had a real problem with anyone being in overlordship over them. The Romans were also a fairly heavy hand in the sense that you had to do what they wanted you to do. They also brought in some of the Roman and Greek perspectives. They brought in some of the concepts of Roman baths and games, things that actually made Jews having to do things which were against what they believed what it was to be Jewish. Their reaction to that was to say we wanted to take back Judea from the Romans. And of course, the model that they used was the Maccabees. People like Judas, the Hammer Maccabeus, he was the hero for these people. And the Maccabees really were the icons of revolution. And so the Zealots took their inspiration from the Maccabees. Now the Zealots in many ways were not a religious group as much as they were a political group. Although of course separating religion from politics was impossible during the time of Jesus. Instead, what you had is that they would then do the kinds of things that would slowly but surely try to undermine the Roman authority, even to the point of doing some terrorist attacks. One of the groups of the Zealots was called the Sicarii. And the reason why they were called that was because of the blade that they used. The blade was a Sicarii, and it was a very thin blade dagger. And what they would do is essentially these Sicarii would hide the dagger in their sleeve. They would walk into a crowd, find a person that they believed was going to cause the most damage to the structure of the leadership. They would stab him in the crowd and then melt away, of course, leaving the person dead. It was those kind of terrorist attacks that grew during the period just past Jesus' life. But we do know that one of Jesus' own disciples was part of this faction, Simon the Zealot. And what we see is that even though the Bible never talks about him, it's interesting that in fact Jesus chose a zealot to be one of his disciples. Almost in a sense, Jesus is trying to say, do a re-education of saying that maybe there's another way in which we can find political freedom. There's another way in which we can develop or work with the society that we are given and the environment that we're given. And so what did Jesus do? He chooses a zealot as one of his disciples. Well, it was after Jesus, in about 66 AD, that the Emperor Nero commits suicide. And it's at that point that a power vacuum begins to develop within the Roman Empire. Who's going to become the next emperor? And it's at this point that the rebels believe, well, this is a time. When the Zealots believe this is the time now, this is the ordained time, the hated Nero is dead, let's now rise up and take Palestine or take Israel or Judea, whatever you want to call it, for ourselves. And so they do, and they rise up in revolt, starting in Galilee. But, of course, the Romans can't afford to have that happen. And so what happens is that it's quelled. This particular rebellion is quelled, but continues to travel south into Jerusalem. Unfortunately, until Jerusalem itself also gets into full rebellion. At that point, Titus, who was to become an emperor, goes and he's sent to go and deal with this rebellion. And he does. And he surrounds Jerusalem, finally breaks into the city walls, and not only does he then kill all the people inside, but he also destroys the temple and the city walls. Jerusalem is destroyed. A small group, though, escapes from Jerusalem into a mountaintop fortress called Masada. Masada was one of the fortresses established by Herod the Great. And they escape to that particular fortress, and they hold it. About 1,000 Jews of this group called the Zealots. Titus surrounds the mountain, surrounds the fortress, realizes he can't get to it by normal means, and so begins to build a ramp to get to it. And once he builds the ramp, he gets there, but by the time they get inside, they realize that all the Jews who were there had committed suicide. For them, it was better to commit suicide than to become slaves for the Roman Empire. That final sacrifice of those Jews, of those zealots, would have thought that in fact the zealotry would come to an end. But in fact, they become martyrs. And as martyrs, again, just like the Maccabees, become symbols of revolution. That revolution continues to foment through until 135, until a Messiah-like figure called Bar Kokhba raises them up in revolt again. This time again, the Romans have very little sympathy for this, and they destroy the Bar Kokhba revolt. And begins then a process of purging the Holy Land of Jews. And the Jews run for their lives into the Roman Empire and beyond. And so comes to an end the reality of the Zealots. When we look at the Zealots, though, we need to understand that when Jesus speaks, he speaks into an environment of political turmoil. He speaks into an environment of hatred, of terrorism, of violence. Now, what would the Jews want to hear in that environment? Well, what they'd want to hear is that God is going to help them overthrow the political overlord. He's going to tell them that in fact the angel armies of God will come and will remove the infidel from the place. Unfortunately, Jesus doesn't say any of that. In fact, what Jesus says instead is, love your enemy. Do good to those who oppose you. It's not quite what the Jews wanted to hear. And because it's not what the Jews wanted to hear, they also couldn't believe that Jesus could possibly be the Messiah that they were waiting for. Because the Messiah that they were waiting for would be the ones that would release them from tyranny, not just enable them to live under tyranny. And so, of course, the rejection of Jesus is there. My problem is that what happened with Christianity is that we began to take the side of the zealot instead of the side of Jesus. What began to happen is that Christianity began to move into violence as the option. That we too, in the turn of the first millennium, went into the Holy Land, killing off the infidel, because we wanted to do it for Christ. And in fact, Christ himself told us that that's not the way we bring the kingdom of God. The way in which we bring the kingdom of God is not through violence, but through love and forgiveness. In fact, a much harder road than the road that the zealots were on.